So we're continuing today with the Warden's operation manual, and we're picking up with how the game works. The majority of what you do during a game is describing the world and the people around the players. The players ask you clarifying questions, which you will answer to the best of your ability. Eventually, the players tell you what they want to do, and you tell them what happens next. Most of the time, it's obvious to everyone what happens next. If a player says they open a door, they open the door. You describe what they see on the other side. Occasionally, it's unclear what would happen. So you decide on a way to determine what happens next. Usually this means setting the stakes of a dice roll and then rolling the dice to see what happens next. You repeat this for a few hours, and then everyone goes home, excited to play next week or month. At the end of the day, Mothership is a social game. The players talk, plan their moves, make schemes, have access to knowledge they shouldn't have, encourage anything that keeps them invested in the game. 26.1 Being impartial. Remember to be impartial. This means sometimes your players one-shot your big bad encounter, and other times they flub and nearly wipe out on what you thought would be an easy encounter. It's not your job to tell a dramatic story. It's your job to create interesting situations and then model the natural consequences of the player's actions as best you can. The story takes care of itself in hindsight. That being said, this is a game and the players are playing competent people. What this game tests is how normal people act under extreme pressure in extraordinary circumstance. It's not as interested in testing if they remember basic facts about the world around them. The players are likely only inhabiting this world you've all created once every week or two, for 2 or 3 hours. Remind them of things they've forgotten rather than taking a stance of, well, they should have written it down. It makes a much better game. So step 1, the Warden describes the situation. This is your main job, describing the situation honestly and eventually to the players. Zoom in or out as necessary. Don't feel like you have to describe every moment. Use all 5 senses. Smell is particularly good for horror. If something seems dangerous, say so. Feel free to talk in character for NPCs if you want. Step 2. Answer the player's question. Encourage your players to ask as many questions as they need until they understand the situation correctly. Sometimes players forget something and need to be reminded. That's fine. The point of this is to make sure you're all imagining roughly the same space. The more information they have, the better decisions they make. Step 3. Players. Wait for them to make a decision. Players decide to act. This can be big, I want to shoot the thing on the ceiling, or small, I want to open the airlock. Everything follows the player's decisions. If they're taking too long, escalate the situation. Tell them an action seems particularly dangerous just to confirm they're aware. There should always be more than one viable option. Step 4. Set the stakes of the conflict. Clearly tell the players the likely consequences of their decisions. This way they can decide whether they want to risk it or not. If the stakes aren't high, you can just skip this. It's tempting to leave things up in the air until dice are rolled. Resist this. 5. Wait for them to commit. Once players know the stakes and what's possible, it's time for them to commit to a course of action. It's okay if players decide they don't like their options and change this. Step 6. Resolve the action. Once the players have decided on their action and determined the consequences, it's obvious what would happen, it just happens. If you're not sure what would happen and the stakes are high, roll for it. Stat checks are proactive actions, saves are defensive. If you're not sure what to roll, make up a house rule. 27.1. Taking good notes. During your session, take notes on a few important things to make prep work easier. We call this AAR, an after action report. As a general rule of thumb, make a small bullet point for who played, what date, new jobs you offered, how much they pay, names of new characters you introduced, something to help you remember who they are, anything you made up or improvised that you need to fill in the details for later, any questions the players had that you didn't have answers for at the time, a quick bullet list of what the players did. Only write a few words per line just to help remind you later what happened, what worked, fun moments, prep that paid off, what didn't work, wasted prep, poor rulings, things to improve. Describing the situation. Your first job as a warden is to describe the world and the people in it to your players. You and the players will almost always be imagining different things, which is great. Each player can imagine a world that most appeals to them. You act as a common ground, distinguishing what particular things are important for everyone to imagine the same. To do this, try and focus on important things. Hit all 5 senses. You can use sketches, toys, or blocks to give players an idea of the space around them. Only describe the horror a little at a time. Never give a complete picture. So there's a tension chart. 28.1. Time. One of the great things about role-playing games is that you can zoom in or out depending on how quickly you want time to move. It's important to know when to move moment to moment or when to just cut to the next most interesting part. Use moment-to-moment framing when you want time to move slowly, where every second counts, and when you want to build tension. Briefly recap all the problems going on before asking the players what they want to do. It's okay to split people up and juggle between groups. If it helps, just go around the room in the corner. Zoom out and skip forward when you want to release tension, introduce a more casual atmosphere, just to cut to the next big decisions the player needs to make. Do not skip over interesting decision points. Ask players before skipping ahead. 28.2. Tension. Tension grounds players in the fictional world and adds weight to their decisions. It is hard to build, however, and a typical night of gaming has a lot of distractions. It's your job to keep things at a simmer and constantly turn up the heat. Building slowly. Don't start off with a horror, set a baseline. Focusing on anticipation. Spend most of your time dealing with the omens of the horror. Use multiple short encounters with the horror rather than one long one. Play everything straight. Let your players be the funny ones. Imagine everything like it's happening in the real world. Most people aren't heroes or villains. If they act afraid, it'll rub off on your players too. A role-playing game is a lot like a game of 20 questions. None of you are really in this imagined space, and you're the one who has read or designed the scenario. So you have access to a lot of answers the players don't. A few things to keep in mind. Players forget things. If you realize they've forgotten something important, just remind them. If you don't know the answer, make it up. Take a note of what you made up in your session report so you remember it later. If they ask the right question, give them the right answer. Don't try and obfuscate what's really going on. The more information players have, the better decisions they will make. This leads to more fun games and helps keep the players from seeming incompetent. If you don't know the answer and it's not important, just tell them you don't know and you'll get back to them. Then note the question in your after action report so you can prepare an answer for next time. What about technology? Something that trips up a lot of wardens is the fear that they don't know how all the technology works. Keep the following in mind and you should be fine. Keep track of it. Create a technology page in your campaign notebook. Whenever you and your table come up with an official explanation for how something works, write it down. It's now part of your official setting. Focus on outcomes. Probably don't know exactly how your phone works, but you know what it does. The same is true for the player characters. Sci-fi technology has the same problems as modern day technology. Things take time, software can be out of date, things break, often. Offload explanations onto players who enjoy it. If you have a player who's really into sci-fi and technology, let them run with the explanations. Players using their real-world knowledge to solve problems is a feature, not a bug. Encourage weird science solutions at a cost. It's great when a player comes up with an innovative solution to solve a problem by strapping a laser cutter to a warp core for some reason. Allow these as much as possible and don't worry about balance. If it seems particularly powerful, have the technology require some kind of consumable power source to use to continue working. The characters know more about the world than the players do. Doesn't matter if you or the players can explain something, as long as it's possible that the characters would know. Setting the stakes. When you set the stakes, you ask, what is at risk if the player fails? Most of the time, the stakes will be low or nothing. Common mundane actions like opening doors or talking to people usually won't involve clearly outlining what failure looks like. However, when the players come in conflict with other people, creatures, or their environment, you should stop and outline what they stand to lose if things go poorly. What are the plausible outcomes? Tell the players what you think is likely. Do you need to outline exactly what happens? No, but giving them a ballpark, particularly when life and death are at stake, is important. There's more than just failure and success. Actions that automatically succeed can have stakes about whether they succeed without cost. Actions doomed to failure can have stakes about exactly how badly they fail. Informed decisions lead to better play. Does outlining possible outcomes ruin the surprise? Not really. It creates a real gamble where players know the odds and can make an informed decision. They can weigh risks and act accordingly, which makes the game more fun. You are all picturing something different. Remember that you and the players are imagining the game world differently. What seems obvious to you might be completely missed by another player. Setting the stakes before each roll helps alleviate this a bit. Over time, you develop a sense of what your players like and what risks they want to know, what they want left to mystery, and you can adjust from there. The rhythm is different for every group and evolves with the campaign. The goal is to give players a chance to correct your logic, change their plans, and to make sure you're all on the right page. Player agency and decision making. The big thing that makes role-playing games so fun is that you can attempt to do anything you want. Yes, there are rules and guidelines and procedures. There are common sense boundaries of what might be possible in the fictional world. But for the most part, if you can think of it, you can try it. We call this ability to change the game in a meaningful way player agency. It means that the players have control over their actions, and those actions have consequences. Player agency is important because it's really fun to play in an imaginary world where what you do matters. It heightens the experience of playing. A good story only happens in retrospect. This means when you're designing scenarios, don't write what you think makes a good story. As long as the players do this. Instead, design scenarios with hard problems, escalating threats, and interesting characters to talk to. Then watch what happens when you set the players loose in that environment. When the game is over, it'll be easier to appreciate the story you all made. 31.1 Principles of Agency. The players need to have enough information to make meaningful choices. Those choices have consequences. Those consequences can meaningfully change the game world. Some choices may lead to good or bad outcomes, but there is not a correct choice that moves the story forward. The Warden should not shield the players from the consequences of their actions, but instead try their hardest to be an impartial referee. If a random roll leads to a consequence so unexpected that the Warden or players now realize they probably shouldn't have called for the roll in the first place, they should undo it, talk about what they did wrong, note any house rule changes in the campaign notebook, and move on. Resolving the action. Once the stakes have been outlined and the players have made their final decision about what they want to do, it's time to decide what happens. Usually, it'll be obvious, but sometimes you need to roll dice to determine what happens next. Here are a few tips on when you should roll dice and when you should just let it happen. 32.1 When not to roll dice. Rolling a lot teaches players that they're limited by what's on their character sheet. Instead, teach them that their choices, not the numbers, are most important. To help them learn, try avoiding dice in the following situations. When the stakes are roll. If you roll on every little thing, the game starts to drag. The players start to feel like they aren't capable of even doing basic tasks. Only break out the dice when it's interesting. 2. When the obvious would happen. When a player wants to do something, it usually just happens. This is usually because the stakes are low or the results are obvious. It's clear to you and the player what would happen. You can skip the roll and move forward. When they have the right tool. A character's class, skills, equipment, patches, and trinkets are just as good an indicator of expertise as their stats and saves. All of these things together say something about the character. 4. When they have a good plan. A game about how the players solve problems in a fictional world, not a contest in who can roll random numbers the best. If the players have figured out the solution, their reward is being able to enact it. 32.2 When to roll dice. Save rolling dice for those situations where you truly don't know what the outcome might be and where the results impact the game significantly. It can be easy to roll for every little thing, and sometimes it's nice to relax and let the dice decide. While none of these are hard and fast rules, the more you lean on them, the more powerful every dice roll becomes, rather than just another turn in a board game. 1. When the stakes are high. Life or death situations, or when failure leads to a heavy burden, are great times to roll. As long as you have clearly outlined the stakes, high stakes moments like these have the most potential impact when left to chance. 2. When the outcome is uncertain. Sometimes even in a high stakes situation, it's fairly obvious what would happen. When it's unclear to everyone at the table what the result of a decision would be, that's another great time to let the dice decide. 3. When they don't have the right tools. When a character is unskilled or ill-equipped, then some amount of instinct reaction or intuition is at play. Stats and saves model this really well, and it's another great time to roll. When the plan is bad. Going off half-cocked without a plan is essentially leaving things to chance. Sometimes characters are acting so frantically and by the seat of their pants that only a random roll can save them. 5. When that's what the player prefers. Some players prefer a playstyle where they don't have to think about every little thing and want to roll. This is fine, though you may want to adjust the difficulty for them. Interpreting failure. Most rolls have a 30 to 40% success rate. This is because stats and saves don't represent a character's natural abilities, they represent how resilient and capable they are on the worst day of their lives. 33.1. What does failure mean? Whenever players roll the dice, the chances are good that they will fail more often than they will succeed. This means it's important for you not to think of rolling as a binary pass-fail system. A failed roll does not mean nothing happens. It doesn't even have to mean that a player fails to achieve their goal. It just means that the situation gets worse in some way. Every roll moves the game forward, whether that's by making the situation better or worse instead of stating you fail or you miss, tell the players how the situation changes as a result of the failure. What new situation are they in now? The game uses a D100 system because it gives you so much room to interpret. Barely failed or barely succeeded can mean something if you let it. This is why it's important to set the stakes of the conflict appropriately to show that a success can mean making the most of a bad situation. Try not to screw up an easy job. Below are a few ideas for how to interpret failed rolls in a way that keeps the game moving forward. Action succeeds but costs more time or resources. Action succeeds but causes harm. Action succeeds but leaves the player at a disadvantage. Action fails and the situation gets much worse. Making up house rules. The rules and procedures given in these books are a collection of what we found most useful when we run games of Mothership at home. But they won't work for you all the time. They are not comprehensive or infallible. They don't guarantee you have a fun or meaningful game. Like tools, you need to know how and when to apply them. And more importantly, when they aren't suiting your needs anymore and something else would get the job better. 34.1. What is a house rule? A house rule is a new rule you and your players invent. You and your friends are the final game designers of Mothership, and you need to add, remove, and tweak it over time to keep it running. Think of the game as your vehicle, and house rules are a kind of routine maintenance. So pop the hood and let's see what we're working with. We'll start with the three main types of rulings. Interpretive rulings. These are so common we don't even think of them as rulings. An interpretive ruling is when you make a decision or judgment call about what would happen in an imaginary situation given all the details you have at your disposal. How bad is a failed roll? How good is a success? Are there any other times you would like to call for panic checks? How should you describe damage? Is it just physical, or does it hurt willpower too? Did the roll almost succeed or fail? How does that affect your interpretation? How does all the technology work in your game? Can a med scanner detect cancer? Can a laser cutter cut through a ship's hull? Procedural rulings. Whenever you decide to use one rule over another, like a save instead of a stat check, you're making a procedural ruling. You're deciding what the best procedure would be to describe the situation. Often the decision is not to use a rule at all, and just to let things happen. Is it absolutely necessary to roll for this? Should this be a stat check or save? Does it have advantage or disadvantage? Is there a better way to handle this? Should it be an opposed roll? Should it only succeed on a critical hit? Is there a rule from another game that would help resolve this better? Should we create a standard procedure to handle regularly covering this event? Systemic rulings. This is what most people think of when they think of house rules. You might change the numbers to dial in the right difficulty, or you might add new skills more appropriate to your setting. If you make enough of these changes, you might even create a new hack of Mothership. Does my setting need any new skills? What about stats or saves? Are there any rules we constantly forget? Should we remove them? Are there new classes my players would enjoy? Is stress and panic working, or is it too intense for my players? Do I want to abstract the economics using debt rules? Do I need to adjust the difficulty level up or down? Most of your rulings will be simple one-offs, but if you make any systemic changes, add them to a page labeled House Rules in your campaign notebook so you can reference them later. 35.1. How do you make a ruling? Anytime you or your players are unsure how to handle something in the game, instead of looking to the rulebook for an answer, just make a ruling. Try to make your best to make each ruling consistent. New rulings should fit with previous rulings rather than be arbitrary. Easy to remember. Everyone should be able to understand your reasoning. Don't create more rules you have to look up later. Involving. Ask the other players for input. Don't turn it into a 3-hour debate. Just go around the room and see what everyone thinks. When you modify rules, the game becomes something unique. Whenever someone joins your table and says, "This isn't how we play it," you'll know you're both doing something right. Finally, don't be afraid to break the game. Anything you can change can always be changed back. The flawed game you play is better than the perfect game that sits on a shelf. 35.2. Making mistakes. Sometimes you make a bad call and something happens that shouldn't have. Usually this happens when you think an encounter should be easy and it turns out to be way more difficult than you anticipated. In these moments, you might be tempted to change the outcome. Instead, just pause the game, tell the players you made a mistake. Get everyone's input on how to fix things, then move forward and try not to do it again. Social encounters. Subtlety and subtext are your worst enemy when it comes to running social encounters. The people your players meet during a session are just as much of a part of the game as a jammed airlock, panic checks, or the cost of fuel. This means characters have to be interactive. And the best way to make them interactive is to say the quiet part out loud. Don't hide who they really are. It's better to have an over-the-top cookie-cutter stock character with clear wants and needs than to have a well-rounded three-dimensional person whose motivations are a complete mystery. Even cagey, deceptive characters should be obviously cagey and deceptive. If you expect the players to fish around to figure out who someone is and what they want, the game will grind to a halt. Once your players know what someone wants, they can make interesting choices about what to do with that situation. 36.1 Lying and Deception. The players will encounter a lot of untrustworthy people in the game. However, guessing whether someone is lying or not just isn't fun. Instead, when someone lies, just tell them. This leads to more interesting play as the players attempt to prove their suspicions, find what the real truth is, and ultimately catch the deceiver. When players lie to other people, just let the players get away with it until the consequences catch up with them. If the players come across a particularly suspicious person or come up with a really bad lie, you can just say there's no way they would believe that. Or you can have the character make an instinct check. 36.2 Negotiation. The game can go to some really fun places if the players don't try and shoot their way out of every situation. However, players often have learned from other games that the most optimal use of their resources is violence, so you may make the first move to show them that their attempts at negotiation will be rewarded. Remember, most people would rather talk than fight. Reputation for violence will follow you. Negotiation requires leverage. In life or death situations, mind players and negotiation might give them time to find an escape. Don't kill surrounded players or they will never surrender. Instead, take the crew to their captor's leader. Want something from the players in exchange for a reward. 36.3 Don't worry about talking in the character's voice or saying word for word what the character says if that makes you nervous. Instead, just highlight the key points of what they talk about and describe what they sound like. With practice, you will find your sweet spot. The trick to violent encounters. The trick to running tense violent encounters is to think of them as disasters happening in real time to real people. Every monster is a boss monster. Do not treat your horrors like obstacles meant to be overcome. Treat them like a force to be reckoned with. For a session or more, as the players slowly learn their weaknesses and eventually defeat them, or don't. Never say you miss. Whenever someone attacks, something interesting happens. Failed attacks destroy obstacles, kill bystanders, or leave the attacker in compromising positions. Every violent encounter is the worst day of someone's life. In real life, when someone tries to kill you, it's a traumatic event with long-term consequences. Most intelligent beings, if they feel they are in danger, try to de-escalate or escape rather than trade blows in a fight to the death. Smart enemies are deadly enemies. Don't treat your horrors as just a bundle of numbers. When an enemy takes a wound, it should change tactics. Smart enemies set traps, retreat, ambush, or target the weak. Defeat does not always mean death. Rescue missions can only happen if the players aren't slaughtered. Try dragging them back to a lair, locking them up in a brig, or cocooning them in webs and leaving them for dead. 37.1 Death. It's really discouraging when you're playing, having fun, and then out of nowhere your character dies. A lot of wardens feel the pressure too. Did I telegraph the danger? Was I being unfair? Should I have changed the dice roll so the player didn't die? A few things to keep in mind. It might happen a lot. If this game tests who you are under the worst possible conditions, if that doesn't sound fun, try altering your difficulty settings. Tell players when they might die. Make every death count. Give them a final scene. Add their death to the roster. When a character dies, add their name, high score, and what killed them to the roster page at the back of your campaign notebook. Make a big show of adding the newly departed to the list so that it feels like a badge of honor rather than a loss. Ask, what do you do? Frame enemy actions as something that will happen to the players unless they do something. Failed rolls move the enemy forward and the players back. For a real challenge that speeds up combat significantly, try switching to player-facing roles in your difficulty settings. I thought it already encouraged you to roll in front of your players. I guess we'll see what that means in about 10 pages or so, which is not today. We might have enough time to get through these 3 pages. If you want to run a compelling horror investigation game, you have to let go of the idea that players ought to be able to solve it. To do this, you need to treat Mothership like the game. Yeah, that's one thing I didn't like. I feel like well, I don't know. I have mixed feelings. It feels like we're getting repeats of the same information at least 2 or 3 different times, maybe more. So that's one thing I haven't liked about today, is most of this seems like a rehash of information we got in previous days. Or really, the 20 questions thing came up earlier today even, I think, just a couple pages ago. 38.1. Never make your players roll to find clues. If they look in the right place, ask the right question, search the room, they find whatever information is there. It's about what they do. If you just give away the clues without asking for a roll, what's the point of the game? The point is what the players do with the information they find. That's where the game is. Do not hint, but do remind. Don't drop hints to your players to help them. The game will be fun whether they solve the mystery or not. If your players have already uncovered some piece of evidence and have since forgotten about it, just remind them. I want to play a game where the players do cool stuff instead of a game where nothing happens because someone forget to take good notes. Use skills. Use the character's skills, background, and class to inform the kind of information you give out. If a scientist and a marine examine the same corpse, they should get different information. Only roll when there isn't time. Sometimes it takes time and resources to get information out of a piece of evidence. That's okay. To tell players that they need a lab for further analysis, or that they need to talk to an expert if they want to learn more. If they take the time or use the resources, they should get the answer. However, if players are working against a hard deadline, like searching a room before a guard shows up or working without resources like the lab is out of power, then it makes sense to call for a roll. Under normal conditions, the players get the information they need. Space is all about vast stretches of nothing happening, punctuated by terrifying life or death decisions. As the players start thinking their ship is just another building or vessel, you'll need to remind them that the ship's hull is the only thing separating them from certain death. 39.1. Ships are expensive. Every part of space travel, from building and repairing ships to refueling and buying tickets, is out of reach for most people. Most players don't need to own a ship to enjoy the game. Instead, they should work on a crew, either for the company or the military, for criminals as a larger part of an organization. Handles all these costs associated. That being said, there's a few ways to handle the economics of travel in your game. Don't start them with a ship. As easy as it sounds, ticket prices for travel, while pricey, are at least something most spacers can afford given a reasonable amount of work. And if not, that's a great time to introduce them to a shady employer willing to get the crew to their destination, as long as they do a little odd job for them. Getting stranded in backwater ports looking for work is a great way to play. Just ask them what they want. Talk to your players and find out what they want to do for the game. If they want to own their own ship, look into making them owner-operators. If picking their own jobs is less important to them, then working for the military or company might be more to their speed. Regardless, it's a simple ask to solve a lot of problems down the road. Skip the paying the bills work. If your players own a ship, then that means, in reality, they own a business. When this happens, it's best to time skip over the months when they're working normal jobs and then zoom in again when something out of the ordinary happens. This is what the bankruptcy save is for. To abstract out the months of normal work and push the game towards something interesting. Do not be afraid to use it. 39.2. Space is dangerous. Running ship combat is all about staying grounded. Remember, it is a last resort. Ship combat is a losing proposition for everyone involved. Ships are astronomical investments for their owners, and even the tiniest mistakes could mean everyone dies. It's a social encounter. No one takes the decision to fight lightly. If ships are fighting, then something important is at stake. Clearly define those stakes and keep up the communication with regular hails to let the players know what the enemies want. Simple decisions have huge impacts. The game is more interested in whether the players decide to fight or flee than it is on of space acrobatics. That's the horror. Once the players have made their decision, the result is out of their hands. Impress this upon them. It's a natural disaster. The ideal ship-to-ship combat scenario involves a creature loose on the player's ship, while a patrol craft attacks them for being in a restricted area. The life support is down, atmosphere is toxic, and a team of Marines attempts to board just when the thing in the vents finally attacks. Ship rounds are encounters. In between ship rounds, let the players try to deal with the fallout by putting out fires, sending hails, negotiating, or making minor repairs before hitting them with another ship round. If the ships are far apart at the upper end of firing range, you can place the turns 30 minutes or an hour apart. If they're on the shorter end, a ship round after every player round is best. No ship-to-ship combat should last more than 2 or 3 rounds at the absolute maximum. Most should end after 1. Alien ships break the rules. Treat ships with otherworldly technology as unwinnable fights, something that you can potentially survive, but not beat. So I do not think I actually have time to read this page like I thought we might get to. we will start right back here with this, with building your campaign. I may do Kane tonight, or I might do last night, kind of bouncing between things. It's really frustrating. So in Prism, it's like I had like the system setting in the lowest it could possibly be without getting muted, but I was still barely audible when we were playing those games last night. So I really want to get that figured out. It's really just frustrating me. But yeah, that's it for now. So possible stream later tonight, and if not, the next stream will be tomorrow. I believe we'll be back with some medicine.